All right, friends and neighbors, thanks again for joining us all tonight. My name is Barbara Jo Limiatis. I am your Program and Outreach Services Supervisor here at the library, and we are so grateful to have Alison Jean Lester here with us to present on her brand new book, Return to the Seam of the Climb, which was written by her father, James T. Lester. Unfortunately, he's recently passed, so she found his memoirs and has released this book on his behalf, and is just excited to be here, traveled all the way from the UK to be with us here tonight. So let's give Alison a big round of applause. Yes, yes. Couple things for housekeeping before we get started. Please silence your phone if you haven't done so already. We're going to ask questions at the end of tonight in coordination with our people online. So please hold your questions to the end, and then we'll alternate between in-house questions and questions from our online audience. Okay. If you're joining us online, please feel free to submit your questions via chat. I'll be checking those throughout. And again, we will alternate those at the end of the evening. If you have any technical issues, online patrons, please feel free to, again, chat me or give us a call here locally at the library. We'll do whatever we can to troubleshoot that virtually. This event tonight is recorded. So if you love it so much and you want to share it with a friend who couldn't make us tonight, within a week, this will be published on the library's YouTube page. So feel free to share it with friends if you really have a great time this evening. Let's see, book sales are happening in the back thanks to McDonald's Bookshop. Feel free to visit them either now or at the end of tonight, where you can get your book signed too. Standard disclaimer here for us at the library. The library sees part of its job as bringing speakers to share their own perspectives for the enrichment of our community. Speakers' perspectives are purely their own. We do not tell them what to say, and we wouldn't want to. They have great perspectives we want to share with us here, okay? Up next, I'd like to introduce Kathy. She is here to join us this night. We are gathered here this evening to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the 1963 American Mount Everest Expedition, in which the first Americans summited Mount Everest. As you may know, Estes Park was home to AMEE expedition member, renowned mountaineer, and beloved community member Tom Hornby. Tom was a supporter of the library. Please. Tom was a fond supporter of the library, and he is the one who recommended the library for tonight's talk. So we can credit him for this evening taking place. He had planned to join this evening, but unfortunately he passed earlier this month. We miss him dearly, and our thoughts are with his family and friends and the countless people who have cared for him over the years. I'd like to bring Kathy up now, and she's graciously offered to say a few words to introduce tonight's speaker. So come on up, Kathy.
Well, you've got that down pat. You can go at 30 miles an hour. So Jim Lester is the Jim Lester is the author, you could say, of this book that's being presented by his daughter, Alison. And I find him unique for two reasons. The first is that he was invited on the 1963 Mount Everest expedition, and he had never climbed a mountain. The second is that climbers come home from expeditions and then they write books and get them published. He came home with a lot of writings and he never published a word of it. He died in 2010 of ALS. So Tom, my husband, was going to introduce Jim's daughter, Alison, who is publishing his writings. Tom's not here. So there are two big holes in this library. And Alice and I are going to try and fill them for you. But as usual, the men have left the women to pick up the pieces. There are some unusual things about Alison. In the first place, she came from a family of writers. Her father, her mother, her brother, and she are all published writers. She's written 6 works of fiction, and she wrote a memoir called Absolutely Delicious about her mother's dying. The other thing is, listen to the places, I have to read this because listen to the list of the places she's lived. lived. She was born in Los Angeles of her father, Jim, who was an American, and her British mother, Val. Within 2 years, they had moved to Virgin Islands, then moved back to Massachusetts. Then they moved to London. And this gets her up to where she went to college, which is in Indiana University. So she went to study music, and she ended up majoring in French and Chinese. Why am I surprised? Then, after finishing her degree, she moved to China. Then she came back to Baltimore to get a master's degree in Chinese studies at Johns Hopkins. Then she moved to Japan, where her 2 children were born. Then she moved to Singapore for 17 years, and she now lives in England. So once I asked her, like where her soul resides, and I don't remember hearing an answer from her. So in the 2 years that Alison has been working on this book, she and Tom have had frequent phone conversations. And as she wrote and edited, I guess, the scene of the climb, I hope I say climb instead of crime. And she was sweet enough to call him a partner in this project. And she's here with her second husband, Andy, and her children, Linus, who lives in Los Angeles and is a musician, as was his grandfather, and Kiri, who lives in New York and is an art therapist.
My turn? Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Tom absolutely was a partner in this. We had been in touch when my father was dying. And by phone, he would call in to support us when my father was dying, because my dad, rather than die the way ALS had in mind, he chose to stop eating and drinking. And Tom had been with another American Mount Everest Expedition climber who had decided to do that some years before, Barry Corbett. And when Tom came home from the hospital this last time, earlier in May, he decided I'm done. And he also chose to stop eating and drinking just in order to settle things down and die the way he wanted to go. So we had been in touch in 2010 when my dad was dying, and again in 2019 when my mother was dying, by phone. So that when I published this memoir of the way my mother owned the end of her death, he was very, very supportive of that. As Kathy said, my father was no sort of climber. And so the usual conversation that I've had in my life is, so my dad was on the 1963 American expedition to Mount Everest. And people will then say, wow, did he get to the summit? And I'll say, well, no, and the faces fall. And then I say, but he was a psychologist studying the climbers. And they'll say, wow, again, and then we can take off and then it's okay. But he didn't, he climbed it to practice. He climbed to 10,000 feet on Mount Rainier with the team. And after Everest, he also climbed Grand Teton, and that was that. So I grew up watching my dad's Everest slideshow. He took a lot of photographs, and what I realized is that it became very familiar to me that only he in the room could feel what he was showing us, because Everest, as it is in here, it fits in the room. You know, it was roughly the size of the sofa on the screen we had in our living room. So I didn't really feel the impact. And as a child too, what dad did, whatever. So only he could feel it. He also, after Everest, you may have read in the introduction to this program, he took 5 of the principal Sherpas and the Nepalese liaison officer on an 8-week road trip across the United States. And it was the first Sherpa group ever to travel in the United States. There was one Sherpa who had reached the United States before then, in 1961, but this was the first group to thoroughly have a look at the States. He did maybe one slideshow about that, and I didn't see it. I was living abroad at the time. When he returned to Nepal in 1998, 35 years after the climb. He was a grandfather of 70 by this time, and had decided to go and see what had happened in the lives of the Sherpas since then. And he came back through Tokyo, where I was living at the time, right after that expedition, that solo expedition, on his way home to the States. And certainly he talked about it, but I don't remember a lot of what he said. My son was 4 months old, and I was quite involved in my toddler and my son. My father was a very, very quiet man. And we also learned later he had walking pneumonia. So I had a babysitter, basically, and I didn't really think a lot about what he had done then. So there he is in Tokyo with me, and the little fellow in the bag there, who's now at the back of the room with a mustache. And that's Dad in the Everest Expedition sweater. Oops. Oh, sorry. Sorry. We're sharing the screen. I didn't think of that bit as a slideshow. Sorry. Barbara Joe is sharing the screen. Hold on at home, those of you at home. So that is the Everest kit. And that little baby in the bag has since worn that sweater to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. Yeah. So, and I just mended it before coming. It's got lots of holes in it now. I will wait until you confirm. Okay, so everybody at home, there's the sweater, there's the baby. Okay. Around end of 2020, early 2021, I realized that my dad, no, when he died, my mother pulled a dog-eared manuscript out of a closet and said, "This is what your dad wrote after Everest." And I had no idea. I had no idea that he had written a book for young readers, maybe middle grade readers, back in mid 1960s. He'd had some interest from a publisher in 1969, but didn't take it any further. So my mother transcribed it. I read it at the time. Again, I don't really recall. 2010, he died. I got married a second time. I was probably, again, a little bit involved with myself. So I don't really remember reading it. So when I realized I was sitting on this manuscript that he had done back then, also the notes that he had written for the slideshow about the trip across the United States with the Sherpas, and a 7-chapter project of a book that he wanted to publish about going back to Nepal to visit the Sherpas. And upcoming was the 60th anniversary of the climb. I knew I was sitting on something very special, because not a lot of non-climbers have done what he did. And actually, nobody has done what he did. He went with them to all the way to Advanced Base Camp in order to study the climbers as they came and went. He's the only man to have taken the first group of Sherpas across the United States. And he was very early in going back to see how they were. So I knew it was possible to make this happen. And it's been a long haul, thanks to my husband who designed the book, thanks to Tom, who was its greatest cheerleader. This is truly the summit of the journey. And I don't know how to tell you how happy I am to be with you, to be with Kathy Hornbein, who I haven't seen since I was not even 11 years old. And my husband, my children, and everybody at home. It is very special for me. And I'm so excited to show you these slides, because he was a fine photographer. So I wasn't just sitting on the manuscript, I was sitting on hundreds of photographs. And some of them that you'll see tonight are not in the book. So this is very special. It's unusual. So before I get into the slideshow, I want to read you a little bit that Dad wrote to himself. at the end of his return to Nepal in 1998 to study the Sherpas and ask them what their lives were like, get it in their own words. He wrote, "Should I have stayed longer in Nepal? Should I have spent more time with the Sherpas I found, dug deeper for insights into their lives? These are questions that won't go away, and I fear I may not have done a thorough job of dispatching my unfinished business. But I'm unlikely to go back again, and for better or worse, this will have to do." So let's see how well it does. That's fine. Before I get to the first slide, I will read to you a little bit from each of the forewords. We have two. The first one is by Dr. Pasang Yangji Sherpa, who is both a Sherpa herself and an anthropologist who is looking at the Sherpa diaspora. Yeah, she's a very, very interesting woman. An email bounced around among various climbing people, and finally, this anthropologist was looking for the person who had driven the Sherpas across the United States. When did Sherpas first come here? And it finally found me, and she thought that she would get the itinerary, but I was able to get her everything he had written about being with them, which was very much his observations of what they liked and didn't like, which he had to observe because they couldn't tell him. They weren't English speakers. So he was watching them and trying to please them. Just a couple of paragraphs from her introduction. Sherpa high-altitude workers have played a crucial role in enabling great human feats on mountains. However, they are rarely acknowledged and usually appear nameless in the background. When Sherpas are mentioned in the literature, the patronizing undertone in writings by their Western counterparts is hard to miss. It is also not unusual to see grateful sahibs write about their Sherpas without critical self-reflection. In this context, Lester's descriptions are refreshing. They include accounts of the first days on the road and his observation of how each member was reacting to the new experiences. There is a level of sophistication with which he is able to compare his own worldview against those of the Sherpas he interacted with over the course of several months in the 1960s. He acknowledges that during the expedition, he was too focused on studying the American team members and their behaviors. In this sense, Sherpas were peripheral to him, even though they were everywhere doing what was essential. To be sure, the papers are true to their era. Sherpa men are referred to as boys, and their experience in the United States described as a guardian would, but such reflexivity as Lester did possess at the time is rare. What Tom had to say about my dad. Our lives first connected as members of the 1963 American Mount Everest Expedition. Norman Durenforth's dream was to put the first American atop the highest point on Earth a decade after the mountain was first climbed by Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. In addition, the expedition had a small research component, which is why Jim Lester, a psychologist who had never climbed a mountain in his life, was there, to observe what personality attributes were associated with a group working constructively together in a high-risk, high-stress endeavor. My dad got the money to do this from the Office of Naval Research. During the Cold War, they were interested in teams in submarines or just high-risk areas, extreme environments. I was there as a member of the climbing team and as the doctor responsible for the oxygen breathing system used to facilitate climbing back in those days. During our months on the mountain, Jim somewhat nervously ascended the icefall to spend weeks ensconced at 21,000-foot advanced base camp. He was a caring presence who provided counsel to various members of the team in addition to his research pursuits. What my dad said about Tom Hornbein is he talks about him at that time. He talks softly, but when he has made up his mind to do something, there is no way to stop him. And although he looks too small to be much good on a monstrous mountain such as Everest, as it turned out, he had as much push and power as anyone, if not more than anyone. Woo! So let's get to Jim's Everest. As you can see in the photograph here, it was a typewritten manuscript on the paper that he originally typed it. There are notes to himself, and on top you have some of the slides from those. You can see this one, August 1963, but you'll be seeing some of those slides from all of the different shows. He met Norman Durenforth actually at a cocktail party. It was a fundraising party, the leader of the expedition. And Dad was kind of at loose ends. Well, he was definitely at loose ends. He was divorced. He was unhappy. He had had a few martinis, and he actually said to Durenforth, "Can I come?" And Durenforth also maybe a couple of martinis, but he said yes. He knew that adding more scientific research would probably get them more money, more funding money. So Dad hustled to put together a program and got the money. So let's see Dad at the beginning of the climb. Getting on, this is February 1963, getting on the plane that would take them to Honolulu. And they did an extensive Asian tour on the way. And I'm going to just show you a couple of photographs because that's not the point, but they're interesting. Number one, when they were in Japan, they went up local mountains. But I want you to notice this man here in the corner. This is a Japanese guy who was up there with them. And you can see he's wearing a mask. This is so common and it's been going on forever. If you're unwell, you put one on. And even in the outdoors, clearly, if they have a cold, they put on a mask. Which when I lived there, 1991 to 99, this is what we ended up doing as well. It's very natural to do. And also, I mean, it's a very crowded country. It's a lot. It's not like Estes Park. Right? My father being a musician as well, he really responded to the music and especially in Kathmandu, where there was a lot of music going on in the streets. And those of you who play the viola, or I know there are people cellists in here, and this man watching the music in the street became part of a photograph with a drummer boy there, who the Sierra Club made this into a poster. So I grew up with this poster over the fireplace. With the beautiful youth of the boy and the sort of furrowed brow of the older man is very interesting to me. Let's get to what was going on in preparation. This is a photo of some of the many boxes that had to be readied and some of the many baskets that were going to go on the backs of the porters. The porter team was 900 strong. It was a huge train of people. Now, to get to Everest is a lot easier. You can fly from Kathmandu to a small and frightening airport called Lukla, but they had to walk. And so about 15 miles outside of Kathmandu was their getting ready station, and they began walking from there to get all the way to Everest. And that was overseen by the only non-American in the American team, Jimmy Roberts, Captain Jimmy Roberts. He had trained the Nepalese army and he could speak Nepalese. So he was in charge of the supplies and the Sherpa, the porters. This is a fabulous photograph of bourbon being weighed to see, because all the porters had to carry a certain amount of weight and not beyond. So they had to ration everything out. As you can see, this is a porter carrying firewood, and he is barefoot. You can see further down, there's also a fellow with a huge box on his back. It was very strenuous, and the people were incredibly powerful and helpful. I don't think this next photo is my dad's foot, but it is in the official account of the climb by James Ramsey Ullman that my dad had the worst blisters. So it took them about 3 weeks to walk to base camp. And so a lot of people as a non-climber, he hadn't broken in his kit as much as the other ones had. So there were doctors along. When they stopped along the way, it often looked a lot like this. You can see the climbers at the bottom right of the screen are having a meal. And then the porters they have their fires. They are bedding down for the night as well, but without tents, like the climbers had tents. If you hold on to your heart, Kathy, here's a little hornbeam beefcake. When they could, they were often crossing rivers and every once in a while would bathe. And in the sun, it's very hot. You can see the far climber is keeping out of the sun. Along the way, also, they had medical calls. When they would get to a village, they would let it be known that they had doctors along. So this is Dr. Gil Roberts, and pulling some teeth on the way up. And people could come and show them whatever they were concerned about. One of the things they learned along the way was that there was a boy, a porter, 14-year-old porter, who was unwell, and he was walking with a bag over his head. He didn't want people to know he was unwell, but they noticed that other of the porters were staying away from him, and it turned out he had smallpox. So he was taken away, and they tested people, but they vaccinated as many as they could and just hoped that they hadn't infected villages along the way, but we didn't have communication. Anyway, the porters were very trusting. You know, they clearly they felt it was in their best interest, and I'm really happy that they were taken care of. But all of it, the blisters, the long walks, and the scares were worth it, because the views more and more were like this as they went higher and higher. As you can see here, these are high altitude Sherpas. They had 37 high altitude Sherpas along. The Sherpas are a people, as you know. It is now referred to as a job. And one of the things that my dad wanted to do in going back was to try to put the capital S back in it. So there were Sherpa porters, and there were Sherpas, right? So these are high altitude climbers of Sherpa origin. And you can tell these are the not porters because they're wearing the red hats, and they are dressed in kit provided by the climb for them. They've got the same wool shirts and down jackets and everything as the American climbers did as well. They were so important. Let's get them to base camp then. Yeah, this is base camp at the foot of the Khumbu icefall. This is where the one fatality in the climb occurred. It was pretty early on, because if this is part of a glacier. The Khumbu Glacier is very long. This is a very steep part of the glacier, and it shifts and moves. So they have to chart a course every season. The course through it has to be charted, and it can move while you're there as well. But let's not get there yet. Let's just say daily life has to go on. Here is one of the cook's assistants. As you can see, we've got corn checks, we've got rice checks, and we've got oatmeal. I don't know what these cans are, but these are heavy things that had to be carried up for the whole team to eat. But this is where it started getting very exciting for the men, and where my dad's climbing chops, such as they were, had to come into play, because there'd been nothing like this in his life. There'd been nothing like this on Rainier. It was all very new to him. Where we are, so they came up, you see, this is the glacier I'm talking about, and this here is the Khumbu icefall. So base camp is here, and the Khumbu icefall is here. All the British climb and the Swiss climb had come up via the South Col here to the summit. And that is what the American climb was intending to do. But you may know that Tom Hornbein, once he had decided to do something, he could not be dissuaded, and he wanted to climb by the West Ridge. So he and Willie Unsold, their effort was going to be, they would split, and they would climb over to the West Ridge and then over this face up through what is now the Hornbein Couloir, because they did that first. So this is where they are. So my father came up to advanced base camp and waited there as they came and went. This is the one photo here, not by my father. This is probably by Barry Bishop, because my father didn't do this kind of climbing. This is what the icefall looked like. My dad could not have held a camera when he went through the ice fall, but trying to get through the ice fall, bits of it were like this, but this size, but shifting. So this, the climber on the right, you see there, Jake Breitenbach, is the young man who died it was not, he was helping to chart the effort through the ice fall. Here he is this is Willie Unsold here, who climbed with Tom Hornbein up the West Ridge. This is Dick Emerson. And this is Dave Dingman, who you'll meet a bit later, and Jake Breitenbach. But a piece of ice about like the size of a house fell on him. Two other climbers, a Sherpa and an American, had to be freed, but could be freed. But Jake couldn't be even seen. So that was a very difficult moment, of course. And so what I'd like to read to you from my father's writing is a little bit not about how they felt about the death. I'll let you read about that yourself. But how he felt afterwards, having to then say, am I going to do this or not? He wrote that it was a very, very difficult decision, but he was never unhappy to have to make the decision. To have this choice was a very interesting choice, but then he decided to do it. There was only one bad moment during the 5 hours we were out of camp. The route passed almost under an enormous block of ice standing on end on a small base and looking very much as though it would topple onto its side at any moment. It was lovely, but nasty looking, and Gil had seen a friend killed by a similar block just 4 days ago. He was not in much of a mood to stop and admire its beauty. He wanted to rush past it and cut down our chances of being in its path if it fell. I found I was absolutely unable to hurry at this altitude, and yet it looked bad to me too, and I knew what Gil must have been feeling. So I pushed as hard as I could to keep him from having to drag me over the snow on my stomach, and I tried to make my muscles work harder even though they felt they were about to quit altogether. We got past the threat. In fact, this block was one of the few in the whole icefall that never moved while we were on the mountain, but at the cost of two things. One, I felt my lungs needed more air than I could possibly take in for them, and they all but screamed at me for that. And on top of that, I felt a kind of panic that comes from feeling you have to do something, but you can't. Naturally, all of this passed in 5 minutes. Two, less painful, but more embarrassing, the effort I put into my leg muscles seemed to have taken energy away from certain other ones, and for the first time since I was about 4 years old, I'm afraid I wet my pants slightly. Not out of fear, but because I was too tired to be afraid, but simply out of overexertion. Small price to pay for the chance to see and touch such a thing as the Khumbu icefall. It was just as we were finishing dinner that evening in base camp that we got word by walkie-talkie from Whitaker, Unsold, and Jerstad. They were calling from on top of the icefall. From the low point reached right after the accident, we flew to new heights of optimism. When the lead party, as well as Hornbein and Emerson, had made their way back down through the whole icefall, arriving back in camp around 6:30 p.m., the whole group's morale was probably higher than at any other single moment during the expedition. We broke out some bottles of whiskey and celebrated. Confidence flowed back into the mess tent. The first American eyes had seen the Khum. It was still March, and we might even hope to make the summit sometime during April. Even I, exhausted from my first efforts in the lower icefall that day, felt like a strong man. Once they had all made their way through, this is advanced base camp. These days, it'll look a little bit more populous, but it was a very, very tiny population up there. And that is where my dad stayed for 3 weeks, until actually he was convinced that he really, for his physical health, needed to go back down because you really start deteriorating. There wasn't a lot to do for a non-climber up there, and he wasn't, because he was studying the men, not the ice or the oxygen, he had to wait for the men to be there. So he took photos of birds. This is a gorak, G-O-R-A-K, in the crow family, obviously, scavenging. There was also a problem. This is Gil Roberts again, the doctor, who is taking care of Dan Duty, who has been felled by thrombophlebitis. So he's got, I guess, a blood clot. And it would have been very dangerous to move him. He couldn't go back down. So he was taken care of by Gil during that time. So then Dad took photos of them. So I want to remind you where we've started. There he was at the beginning. Let's see where he is now at Advanced Base Camp. Oh, unlike he ever has been. A lot thinner. He lost 40 pounds on the trip, and a lot of it would have happened up there. And clearly he's at the controls. Actually, obviously he didn't take this picture. It was probably Gil Roberts took the picture because they were there for a long time. The first climber to head for the summit is Jim Whittaker. Jim Whittaker is the last man standing. He is the last American climber. There are still Sherpa climbers alive, but he's the last American climber alive from this climb. And he went to the summit with Nawang Gombu Sherpa, who was the nephew of Tenzing Norgay, who went to the top with Edmund Hillary. And these two had climbed together before, really trusted each other, and Dad said they were like brothers. They were very, very close. Norman Durnforth was to go with him. He was documenting everything. This is the leader of the climb, Norman Durnforth. But his health wouldn't allow it. He was quite a lot older than the other climbers. So he went as far as he could, but then Jim Whittaker and Gombu took photos of each other at the top rather than having somebody else do it for them. What I want you to note also is, you remember the photograph of my dad and his beard. Some of the guys shaved the whole time. Look at this, wanted to be clean shaven on the summit. It's fascinating. So another photo not taken by my dad, obviously. This is the South Call. And this is people getting stuff up as high as they could for the final summit approach for Jim and Gombu. This is the place that you see the photographs of people just sardines all the way up. Yeah, but they were the only ones there at this time, fortunately. Once that had been achieved, then it was time for Tom and Willie to work out the way they were going to do it. They had to wait to see how many resources were left. Norman really wanted more than two guys to get to the top. And so there was a second South Call Summit pair ready to go up as well. But Tom and Willie Unsold, you can see the intense looks on their faces here. And I really feel like this is a good example of them just, how are we going to get this done? Listening to Durnforth as the leader saying, I'm not sure. Sometimes he like, you can't do it yet. Or there were times when, no, you can't have that oxygen. You know, we need those tents, whatever it was. As I said, Tom was in charge of how oxygen delivery and how that was working out. But the two of them were steadfast and very careful husbanding resources for this West Ridge effort. It's a very, very exciting story, the West Ridge effort, and I'm not going to tell it. First, because Tom has written about it so incredibly well in his book, Everest, the West Ridge, which probably is available in this library. It's also available at your local bookstore, McDonald. So let's leave that there. It was exciting. It was dangerous. It was incredible that they got it done. In fact, I'm going to do a reading from just a little bit of how my dad wrote about them coming back. So you get a feeling for what it was like, because they didn't know what was going to happen. They were incommunicado in these days. Day began to dawn at around 4 a.m. By 5, all were awake, staring out at the clear, windless day that the sun was bringing to life, recognizing that they were still alive, even recognizing that this dawn was possibly the most inspiring they would ever see. We watched the sunrise from the most commanding spot in the world, and about 5:30, they too began to rise. There was no tent to take down, no camp to break. Still roped together, they shook themselves and moved around a bit to loosen some of the stiffness and moved down. Tom and Willie a bit ahead of Jerstad and Bishop, who had gone to the summit via the South Call. They were still a long way from base camp and an unthinkably long way from Kathmandu, but they were still alive and very close to human help in the form of Dingman and Gurmi, who met them about 6:30 or 7, gave them oxygen, and helped them down to Camp 6. A sudden attack of bad weather on this day would have been a disaster. But the day was glorious, and Dingman's support team, including 2 Sherpas, urged the 4 others down to the call for a rest and some nourishment there, then down across the top of the Lhotse face to Camp 4 and beyond. At 5 in the afternoon, the struggling band was somewhere between Camps 4 and 3 at the regular hour for walkie-talkie contact between parties on the mountain. Amazingly, Unsold's walkie-talkie was working. Not only did he reach advanced base to let Miller and Jimmy Roberts, who would help them thaw their feet, know they were coming for the night, but they also reached us at base camp. And this walkie-talkie contact came at just the same time that Duty was talking on the big radio with Kathmandu, so that Unsold and Bishop, still not out of trouble, were able to send messages through Duty to their wives who were both there in the radio shack in Kathmandu. And the men on the Lhotse face could receive their first congratulations from their families and from the world. They reached advanced base about 10:30 that night. I wish I had been there to greet them and talk with them, but maybe there wasn't much talking at that point. Dingman examined their feet and found that only hornbinds had apparently not been severely frozen. Jerstad's were not so bad as Unsold's and Bishop's, and it seemed very likely even at that point that for those 2 the loss of most of their toes was probable. The next day the weather continued to hold, and advanced base camp was finally closed up. Everyone left it, some now on thawed feet that were intensely painful with the return of feeling. They all kept moving, descending to Camp 1, then down through the icefall for the last time. I don't remember now who arrived at base camp first. The sun had recently dipped behind the mountains around Namche, 20 miles south of us, and we rushed out to welcome and help them into camp in a grayish light. Or maybe it was just their faces that were gray. Jerstad was able to muster a tiny smile around one corner of his mouth, while Bishop kept his eyes seriously on his feet as he painfully put one in front of the other over the rocks coming into camp. Unsold was having more trouble than Hornbein, but both managed to give big smiles to us when we greeted them with hugs and mugs of hot tea. Durin Firth assigned Ang Dawa, faithful, devoted Ang Dawa, to run his movie camera as he went out to welcome the heroes home. But Ang Dawa had been drinking Chang since early in the afternoon and was now feeling no pain. I saw him look through the viewfinder and start it rolling, but then he seemed to forget it was a camera and knocked it gently spinning on its tripod as he left his post to throw his arms around each of the 4 as they passed, his eyes full of joyful, drunken tears. So this is Lut Jerstad, whose toes were unrecoverable, really, and he had to be carried. He and Willie Unsold were carried by Sherpa, or this looks like a porter, down to Namche Bazaar. And what they did was they would have, each of the climbers would have a team of 4 who would carry him for 20 minutes at a time, and then they would tag team it all the way down. Once they got, oh, this is some Sherpa frostbite. Yeah, so the toes were worse than this. Not nice, very painful. When they got down to Namche Bazaar, they were able to get contact to Kathmandu to ask if they could be helped, and they were able to rouse a helicopter, which was of course fascinating to the villagers in Namche Bazaar. But the rest of the team had to walk back to Kathmandu. So some of them wanted to spruce themselves up. So this is Dave Dingman getting a haircut and a shave from in the rain in one of the villages on the way down from somebody in pajamas. I wanted to tidy up. Once they were in Namche Bazaar, they took a group photo of the most important Sherpa climbers who had helped them. And this photo proved to be very, very helpful to my dad as he undertook his later adventure. But let's not get there yet. Let's go first to this reversal of roles where my dad becomes their driver and guide and helper along this adventure in the United States. This is Dan Duty, recovered from his blood clot. and they taking them to play mini golf for the first time. And you can see the beautiful outfit. They had been to Europe first before my dad started driving them around, and they had exquisite taste. So they had very fine Roman shoes. And yeah, enjoyed shopping very much. General Motors loaned them a station wagon. And you see the old U-Haul on the top. So from left to right, you have, this is Girmi Dorje. This is Elit Sering. This is Nawangombu, who went to the top with Jim Whittaker. This is, now let me see if I can get his name right. Captain Hobker Shamsher J.B. Rana, who was the Nepalese liaison officer. They called him Noddy. And he was a very, very fine liaison officer for them. Up on the roof there is Ang Dawa, who was Norman Durenforth's assistant the whole time. They had climbed several times together, and pushing in the back for some reason is Nima Tenzing. He had been Jake Breitenbach's Sherpa companion. So he had a very hard time with the death of Jake, but went on to prove to be extremely helpful also in helping the summit pushes. Noddy could speak English pretty well. Gombu thought he could speak a bit of English. The others didn't. They loved driving in the car. Here's a lovely photograph of them. Obviously, no seatbelts in those days. And there's a wonderful bit in the book about when Dad was pulled over by a police officer at one point and how fantastically funny they thought that was. Went to Coney Island. They, shooting guns, that was not a thing for them. And one of the things I really love about this photograph is the focus of the children, that they wanted to see whether or not he could shoot. And that as much as they wanted to see how much anybody could shoot, the little boy's mouth hanging open with fascination. Dan Duty lived in Connecticut, so they were visiting him there after New York, and he took them to a couple of farms. And one of the things that my father noticed about being with the Sherpa climbers in the farms was that they were never impressed by the machinery. In fact, they were a little bit worried by it and seemed to identify with the animals and the feelings of the animals a bit more. You can see how affectionate Ang Dawa is here, and Nima Tenzing here doesn't quite look like he thinks it's a good thing that's being done. But again, as I said, this was my dad just trying to pick up the signals. One thing he said was that he really felt like Americans wanted to impress them. Like, look at this big thing. Look at this effective, productive thing. And they were a bit embarrassed by that, or a bit bored by that. So he was trying to pick up on on the signals. They went to a coal mine called Mountaineer, and went down into the ground in West Virginia, I think that was. Nawangombu was what they called the big man. Do you know the Sherpas talked about themselves as little men, and he was the big man, and he wanted to try everything. So here he is in a Ferrari. Here he is learning to swim. Here he is whitewater rafting. He was always going to be the one to take the oars, and he was always, Dad knew from the beginning, he was always going to be the one to go to the summit. They went to a ranch as well, and ever since this period, there has been a real appreciation in the Sherpa community for cowboy hats. So if you go to Nepal and are among Sherpas, you're likely to see cowboy hats. So it may be that these guys brought some home. You see, they kitted them out completely for the ranch. Also at this ranch was this pretty young stewardess named Valerie Brown. Let's see. Oh, look, there she is again. Look, there she is again. Jim was ostensibly taking a picture of Ang Dawa, but he may have also been taking a picture of Valerie Brown. Valerie Brown was a lovely 23-year-old stewardess who was on the plane that between New Delhi and Beirut. It was the same flight, just going back around, that Pan Am flight that was going back around to take, and the Sherpas were on the flight with my dad and James Ramsey Ullman. She was working first class, but had noticed that there were Sherpas on the flight. She noticed the name Nima Tenzing. She remembered that Tenzing Norgay had been with Sir Edmund Hillary. She was British. She wanted to go and talk to the Sherpas. So she went back to the cattle class and tried to chat up the Sherpas. Had no eyes for the American men. However, my father hadn't seen a woman like her in about 4 months. And so figured out how to find her afterwards. And eventually she paid attention to him. And being a stewardess, she then could fly for free in the States and would show up. She would try to be where they were so that she could get to know him. And they got married, and that's why we're here. So, which is awesome. Remember I told you that he was trying to figure out what they really liked, and what they really, really liked was shopping. They loved it. And then he finally tweaked it. Like Sherpa, traditionally, the Sherpas are traders. They traded between Nepal and Tibet, crossing the mountains and figuring out what they needed and what they could sell, et cetera, et cetera. And the American climbers were no match for their trading prowess, and they were taken, for everything they had when they went shopping, the Americans. So it really, he then learned that they needed more days out to themselves, just window shopping. They didn't have to buy anything. They liked to try stuff on. They really enjoyed that. They ended up in Seattle, where they were very high on Jim Whittaker. Jim Whittaker was from Seattle. He made it to the top, big posters around. Tom Hornbein and Lou Gerstad, not so impressed, covering up a picture of Jim Whittaker at the top. Let me read you a little bit about the joy in shopping that he noticed in the Sherpas. And this is something that the anthropologist Pasang Sherpa is putting in her book about the Sherpa diaspora. They were wild about window shopping, just strolling down the avenue, any avenue, and observing the really fantastic variety of objects offered in the windows. I could make our stay in any town a success by giving them an afternoon on their own for this kind of strolling. Dombu's day was made one afternoon in New York when he found a knee-length winter jacket he liked and discovered on the label the trade name Sherpa coat. Might have ended there, with laughter all around, but Dombu chose to ask the sales clerk if he could tell him what Sherpa meant, and found the clerk had no idea. For this merry crew, swamped with recognition and too much attention, this was such a welcome relief and such a comical contrast with most of their experience so far over here that they were still giggling about it days later. Dombu was reunited with Jim Whittaker at Jim Whittaker's home, and you can see the affection between the two men. And here's a final shot of them all now. My dad, cleanly shaven, possibly under the influence of young Valerie Brown. And you can see Nadi. So you can see Nadi he is Nepalese, not Sherpa Nepalese. So he's slightly different from the rest of the men. But don't they look tanned and happy in their suits and comfortable? And it seems like they had a really good trip. After this development of this relationship with them, they stayed on my dad's mind, which is why he went back and returned to the scene of the climb. That I know it's cheesy. It wasn't my idea, but I like it. It was my father's idea. He'd written it somewhere in his thing, and we like it. So he's back on a plane, seeing Everest again from the window of an airplane. And I think he was a little nervous about how it was going to go, but he was on his way. This is the reason he went. This man, now Dr. T. Wang D. Sherpa, is the son of Ela Tsering, who was one of the guys my dad took around the States. And Dad heard in around 1998 that he was about to graduate. He was going to be the first Sherpa to graduate from an American medical school, the son of an illiterate climber. And it blew my father's mind, and he thought, I need to see what has happened in between. I have talked to him. He has a family practice in Pennsylvania, and his 3 sons work with him there, and his wife is his nurse, and it's a very loving community. Dad imagined that there would be some English spoken now because he knew about the development of the climbing industry, and he knew these guys, a lot of them would be part of it, but he did hire a guide and interpreter to help him. On the right, his name was Sherpa, to help him. And this is a photograph of Sherpa probably trying to get information out of this older fellow about where the Sherpas might be. Sherpa took him around to see how many of these guys Dad could find. Dad took a photocopy of this photo. Here it is, with Sherpa hands poring over it. He went to Namche Bazaar, where he knew some of them would be, because 1998, Google hit the streets in 1998. You know, we didn't have a lot of interconnection this way. And even if we did, they might not have, right? So this was all done by, I'll show up with a photo. He'd learned in Kathmandu about where some of them probably were. But he couldn't call anybody. He couldn't email anybody. So fortunately, in Namche Bazaar, he was able to find a few, and this is a fellow called Pasang Tendi. You haven't met him before, and I would like to read to you what my dad wrote about his interview with him, because it really represents the experience for a lot of the Sherpas who were on that climb. Sherpa and I left Kancha intending to return to the Panorama Lodge for lunch. On the way, we had to move off the narrow trail to make room for several yaks and a Sherpa. The man turned out to be Pasang Tendi, one of the class of 63, whom I didn't expect to find in Namche. We seized the moment and went into his Namche house for an interview. Pasang Tendi was 18 in 1963, and so still only 53 when we met on the trail. His grandparents were born in Tibet, his parents in Kumjong. Until 1963, he lived the conventional life in Khumbu, helping his father farm and care for their yaks, but all the while with expeditions on his mind. He heard about the American expedition to be formed in Kathmandu and made his way there, where he managed to be hired as one of our 900+ porters. This is what he had hoped for, had gone there for. It seems that as far as Tengboche Monastery, the next day's stop after Manamche, he served as Jimmy Roberts's personal porter. For some unknown reason, perhaps related to the fact that Pasang's older brother, Ang Tsering, was already on board as a Sherpa climber, at Tengboche, Jimmy changed Pasang's status from porter to Sherpa, meaning that he would stay with the expedition when the porters were dismissed and participate in the climb. It was a big jump for Pasang, who thought he would have to porter for several years before he could qualify as a Sherpa. Once above base camp, Pasang was assigned, beyond the general load carrying that all the Sherpas did, as personal Sherpa for Tom Hornbein and Willie Unsold, who were 2 of the more remarkable climbers on the team. He carried at least 1 load to the South Col, and then became one of the support team for Tom and Willie's attempt on the unclimbed West Ridge. At one point, in preparation for the summit attempt, Pasang was with a small group of Sherpas camped above advance base on the West Ridge route, when an avalanche caught them by surprise. Hornbein wrote in his diary, "To add to the excitement and to our difficulties, yesterday 4 Sherpas cooking tea in the tents at the dump were suddenly accosted by a powder snow avalanche. It carried them several hundred feet downhill, rolling them up in the tents and providing a nice ride down. Their axes, crampons, and ropes sitting outside were lost. They came down to advance base without them, but able to laugh at the whole episode. All 4 kept their good humor as they descended to base camp for rest, but only Pasang Tendi volunteered to go up on the West Ridge again." Pasang was back on the West Ridge a few days later when Hornbein and Unsold got their spectacular ascent and traverse of the summit underway. Pasang and 4 other Sherpas carried loads to a high point of 27,200 feet. From there, Tom and Willie were on their own. Ullman wrote only what everyone knew. No one knew better than Willie Unsold and Tom Hornbein, taking their leave from the 5 Sherpas, but if it had not been for what these, their companions, had done that day, carrying loads so high, there would have been no tomorrow, whatever the outcome. I asked Pasang whether he had liked being on Everest, and Sherpa gave me his reply. Yes, he said he did. He was young and he was strong and he really liked it. Pasang went to Everest again as a climbing Sherpa with an Indian expedition in the middle 1960s and carried loads to the highest camp. The Indian member with whom he was paired on that trip asked him to go back on the International Everest Expedition of 1971. Pasang joined, but while he was still at base camp, his wife hiked up from Kumjung, several days' walk up to 18,000 feet, and demanded that he leave the expedition. That put an end to Pasang's climbing. Any arguments he might have had made later were probably silenced by the fact that the Indian member with whom he would have been climbing was killed on this expedition. This fellow, Dad was able to find just above Namche, and it is the man just at the bottom was the Sherpa that was assigned to my father as his companion. Generally, people talk about the Sherpas as a very amiable and happy bunch of people. This guy was not. And they didn't form a bond. And there was no language in common. And in fact, because my dad actually stayed at Advanced Space and didn't need a companion, he wasn't climbing anymore. His name is, Dawa Tenzing. He then helped to take loads up to the higher camps as well. But what was interesting about finding him and talking to him was that Dad was understood that he really didn't like climbing. He didn't like really being on that expedition. He was making money. He wanted his own house and he wanted his own yaks. And so it told my father that the happiest time in his life was the moment that he was able to buy this house built into a rock and to buy his yaks. And the worst time in his life was when the yaks, I can't remember if it was a drought or something that killed his herd. But he likes to live quietly. That's that in 1998, that was his youngest son, who was 14 at the time. But I don't know if you can tell from there, but he's not smiling for the camera. But it was really important to my dad to find him, to see what had happened to him and to understand him a bit better. It was very hard work from there on, though. This is traffic along the way. It's not, the thing is, it's not just, there's only a season, just like here in Estes Park, there's only a season for the climbing. Daily life goes on the rest of the time, and these yaks have to go somewhere, and the rain has to pour. And so that's probably Sherpa in the red trying to show him, you got to come this way to keep going. And they were socked in at times. And my dad was wondering, are my knees going to make it? Am I going to make it? But he finished what he could do in Nepal, and then he went to Darjeeling, because a lot of the Sherpas actually went to Darjeeling to join climbs from there as well, including, this is Nawang Gombu, who was there then, and this is Angdawa, and this is Angdawa's son. And so he had a good couple of days with the Sherpas there. Then he went back to Kathmandu to talk to Nima. Now, I told you Dave Dingman was going to feature a bit later. Dave Dingman was one of the other doctors on the climb, and he was a plastic surgeon. Nima, as a young yak herder, like a lot of the Sherpa climbers were as young people, had his eye gored by a yak. And so Dave Dingman took him to his hospital where he was working, and he operated on this eye. So here's a portrait of Nima, and Nima was very shy. You can see he is the type he was the one who was looking at the cow with concern. This was Nima in 1998, very confident, well-fed, running a very popular lodge in Kathmandu. You can see the scar on his eye, which seems also to be keeping that eye open. He is, you remember Dr. Wangdi Sherpa, who's the first Sherpa to graduate from medical school in the States. He is married to Nima's daughter. Nima is still alive, living in Kathmandu, and very well. And here he is now. Isn't that great? Wangdi sent me this photograph so we could see. And that eye is still helping him see the world. So that was a lovely, I think that was a lovely result of that expedition across the United States. In 1999, the American team got back together. They were doing 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, 40-year anniversaries. They got together a little earlier than they might have because of the health of some of the climbers. Gambu went along. So Gambu and Jim Whitaker were reunited for this. Again, they have a great sympathy between the two of them. Gambu died in 2011. When I was developing this presentation for you and telling people that I knew in the States who could watch via Zoom that I was doing it, a friend of my parents wrote and said, "Oh, it seems like it's now the time to send you this photograph that I took in 2003. There was an Everest conference at Princeton, and for some, he was doing something related, and so he went down and he sent me this photograph. Tom Hornbein and my dad, 2003, with their arms around each other. They were not an obvious pair. My dad was very retiring and not a climber. And he said he didn't set his mind to things he thought maybe that might be a good idea. And Tom made a lot of things happen, but it was around the 40th anniversary that they started to become close as older men. And there became a great sympathy between them. And I think because they were both in their own ways quite philosophical people and could talk about that. So we've come to 2003 now. As you know, Tom, my dad died in 2010. Tom died on May the 6th. I hope that you feel that they've been here with us. And I do. And I have been so happy to be here in Estes Park for this. We went, my kids and my husband and I went for we did the Two Owls hike. Is it the Two Owls? Twin Owls hike in light rain and heavy hail just before this. And there was a moment where I was like, Tom, just like, but it did make me think. And I said to the kids, like, just imagine Everest though. Like, what is this? This is nothing. Come on, let's keep going. So what I would like to end with before I open for questions is you've seen photographs of what it was like. The men not wearing Gore-Tex, they were wearing wool, they were wearing leather, they were wearing down. You've seen how quiet it was at Advanced Base. You've seen how there was only one team on the South Col. Obviously, this is now climbing season in Nepal right now. Three Sherpas have already died in the icefall. Trying to find, they were not going for the summit themselves. These were people who were trying to find a route through because they're the hosts and their clients want them to find a route through so they can climb safely. The first foreign climber to get to the summit this year was a woman from Pakistan. And also this year, in this short season so far, 2 Sherpa climbers have climbed to the summit for the 25th time. It might be 26th. It's true. One of them got up, broke the record of 25, and the other followed. There's also many women have now climbed Everest. And just yesterday, I believe, the first double amputee made it to the top. He was a Gurkha who had lost his legs in Afghanistan, and he made it to the top. Obviously, he was surrounded by people, probably either other Gurkhas, Sherpas probably helped as well. There's a tremendous amount going on in the mountain. And interestingly, just before I came on, I was talking with a woman in the crowd who told me that in high school, she had written her thesis paper on Everest, the Unconquerable. Am I right? Is that the title? Unconquerable, she doesn't want you to know who she is. Unconquerable Everest. And it was 1953, and she knew the British were going up there, and she was very disappointed that they actually conquered it because she does not feel it should be conquered. And I understand that. And there are a lot of Nepalese who don't feel it should have been conquered. But whatever they felt in 1963, I think is probably intensified now. So more is being done now to try and clean it up. There's a lot of trash and there are a lot of dead bodies. You may know that there are a lot of dead bodies on there. So I think that trying to raise visibility for the people who live there and who work there and who are the hosts of the climbers is really important. And before flying here, I was trying to check in on American Airlines and going around and around in circles. And I had scrolled to the bottom of the page. It said powered by Sherpa. It's a software. It's maddening. It's really, really maddening because it's the idea of service. Do you know, the idea of we are here just to serve you because you're the one who's important. That's not what it is. And so I hope that if anything from this, what I want you to take away is that they are hosts. They are hosts and they are business people, and they're risking their lives for people who don't necessarily give them the capital S. So thank you so much. Let's switch over to questions. And I want, thank you. Do you want to switch away from do you want to stop staring at the screen? And I think some of your questions may be more easily answered by Kathy. So I might, if she's available, if you have questions, because I can't hold the whole book in my head. So I may not have the answer for your question. Yeah. Oh, yes. Should I just go ahead and go with this one right here? Yeah, sir.
I just wondered if in preparation for doing this book, have you gone over to base camp and seen all of this yourself?
No, I haven't. I mean, my son has, amazingly, and my husband's been to Nepal. My mother went bird watching in Nepal, but I have not been there. All of this happened during the pandemic. So this preparation was during the pandemic. I would have loved to go over. Right now, there's a tremendous amount going on in Nepal, in the Solo Khumbu region around in the foothills of Everest, because it's the 70th anniversary of the first ascent. So, but Pasang is there, the anthropologist, and she said, there's going to be no space for you. Nobody wants to talk about this, the Americans right now. And they're opening a Hillary museum there as well. So she counseled me that I would be trying to, muscle to the front, and that wouldn't have been appropriate. So I have not. I've only looked at photographs. Do you have any questions from the? Oh, no chat questions. Do we have any other questions from the floor? Oh, no, I talk a lot, don't I? I filled out okay, there's one in the middle.
I'm just curious, as a writer, how did you organize this? Did you do it chronologically? Did you do it by different people and piles and all on computer, or was there physical stuff? How'd you do that?
It was very interesting. Thank you. Because I'm normally a novelist, it was an interesting and different experience to be an editor of something that I couldn't change very much. So I had actually thought that the most important bit of the information was the unique stuff, really, that maybe I should start with the Sherpa, the return to the scene of the climb, and then say, and here's what came before. So I moved things back and forth for a while, but then I realized probably if you didn't get to know the man, you might not hang out for that bit. And the bit that he wrote about the first climb is a much more intimate piece of writing on his part, probably because he was writing for younger readers. He found it impossible to talk down to children, so it doesn't read at all like he's speaking to children. But the advantage is that he explained things very clearly because he didn't assume any knowledge. So that's quite intimate. And what it was like, as Kathy said, to be the one non-climber on the, he struggled a lot more, I think. And Tom quipped that he's the one person he ever met who went on a climb like that and returned not wanting to climb again. Like, he just was not bitten by the bug, but he was bitten by a fascination for why people climb at all, because he didn't have that. So what was, as a psychologist, what was it about them? Interestingly, one of the things that he felt and learned from talking to them was quite a lot of them have daddy issues and need to prove themselves, but it's not like that for all of them. So there was a lot of what comes first, and a little bit of updating some of the language references that aren't necessarily current. but it was engineering rather than creative. I did write an introduction and interstitial stuff to try and tie it all together, and I enjoyed that very much. Yeah. Anything else? Oh, yes, there you are. There's your microphone.
This
Not you.
question's for Kathy. Kathy,
Kathy.
when Tom returned, did you notice a difference, or your family notice a difference? How was that? How was that reunion?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right. Kathy is post Everest.
Everest was hard on the marriage of Jean and Tom. And it was basically over when he got back. So let's see, that was in 63. I didn't meet Tom until, oh boy, 68, 71 or so.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I remember in one of the talks that Tom gave, this woman came up and she said, "Oh, what was it like for you?" And I said, "I wasn't there."
Yeah, exactly. Nothing. Yeah.
And in fact, I think it was very hard on Gene.
Yeah.
He had 5 young children. He was gone for 5 months.
Yeah. Yeah.
I might not have stuck it out.
There's one in the front.
Sponsored that wonderful trip across the country in that car.
Department.
The State Department. paid for
Yeah,
that?
the State Department gave the money and yeah, gave them a budget, and it was billed as a goodwill, like, thank you for making this happen. Like, they recognized it couldn't have been done without the Sherpa. However, that also suspected that there was a little bit of political gesturing as well, because of wanting to show a connection to Nepal at a time when they felt the Chinese communists were a bit overbearing. But either way, Dad had a grand time. Yeah.
I'm worried about the fingers and toes.
Yes.
What happened to those? Did they have to be severed?
Removed. They were
my
removed. Yeah,
goodness.
they were. And Tom was very, very lucky. So why did Tom not lose his toes? One of what he told me he felt was, Willie told him in the night, they were sleeping exposed, or not sleeping, waiting out the night exposed. Willie asked him to take off his boots and put his feet on Willie's belly so he could keep them warm. There was a very strong connection between these two men. Anyway, after a while, Tom was like, this isn't working for me. So he put his feet back in his boots, but they were untied, they were loose. And he felt like his blood could flow a bit more easily than the guys whose boots were tight for climbing. So it wasn't that Willie had kept his feet warm, but that his boots weren't as tight. Yeah, but the other guys lost most of their toes. Yeah, you have one. Yeah.
Audrey Strait would like to know, did Jim publish any findings from his participation in the climb?
Yes, he did. That was property of the government. He did the results of his study, I think, in a couple of sections. He wrote some initial articles and then kept crunching the data and did some more. You can find publicly, you can find what he wrote for Alpine Journal in 1969. If you look online, you can, if you do James T. Lester and Everest, it'll come up, and you can find articles that he wrote about what the study was and how he did it. It had a lot to do with how the Navy wanted to know, how do we choose the right sort of team so that things don't go haywire once they're under the water? Or NASA was also interested once they're up going on their way to the moon. How can we make sure the team hangs tight? What sort of attributes will work, or what sort of tests do we do before they go to find that out? That's what it was about. So have a look up. Thank you, Audrey. Have a look for James C. Lester and Everest, and you'll find stuff online. I didn't put them in because a lot of it is private, and a lot of it you have to pay. Some of it is held by universities. And so this is a self-funded book. So, you can get it if you're really interested. But the Alpine Journal article is publicly available, and you could get a general idea of what he did. And some of it was also because he was reading the diaries. They had to keep diaries that he was reading. So it's all, that's why in the book, I quote from those diaries, what he quoted from the diaries, but there's nothing just generally about them particularly. Did I just say generally about them particularly? You can take that as you like. I don't know what I mean, whatever. Fell off that one.
I've forgotten her name already, but
Yeah.
your father's second wife, the honey on the trip.
My mother.
What happened
Yeah.
to her? Oh, she's your
Valerie,
mother.
she's my mother. Yeah.
Oh.
No, yeah. So yeah, his first wife, Lois. Yeah, that didn't work out, and that's why he was like, "Let's get out of here." Yeah, Val. So she gave up flying. She moved out. She was based in New York, and she gave up flying. She married him and gave up flying, and had the two of us, my brother and me, pretty quickly. And then, so she had been brought up by a very traditional British couple, and who girls were educated to a certain point. So she had been she went to boarding school, she went to finishing school, she went to secretarial school, you're done. But she was very intelligent, and my dad was very supportive. So she started going to college at age 40. And she ended up being a university teacher of humanities. And then she started writing her own books. So she was largely a biographer. She was descended directly from Charles Dickens's principal illustrator, Pablo Knight Brown, who goes by Fizz. And so, which is why I'm British as well as American, but via her line. So she wrote a biography called Fizz, the Man Who Drew Dickens, which is a really, really good, if you're interested in Victorian illustration, we can do that another day. But yeah, What My Parents Wrote by Alison Jean Lester. But yeah, she really developed into the intellectual that she was meant to be, and wrote a lot of books. Yeah. She died in 2019. So the book that I wrote, the memoir that I wrote that Kathy referred to, called Absolutely Delicious, the subtitle is A Chronicle of Extraordinary Dying. And the library has talked to me about maybe talking about this book via Zoom with the book club for mortals. I think you have one. Yeah, you're in that book. Yeah, because it's about, as I told you, my dad chose to what's called VSED, voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, just to own the end of your life. My mother had metastatic melanoma, and when she had decided she'd had enough treatment, this very busy, objective driven woman decided to retire from the rest of her life. So she checked into residential hospice and stayed for 9 weeks in order to enjoy the end of her life. And so that was very, very interesting, and I was with her for the whole time. So I had to write about that all, because I think it's unusual to have even one parent who's very communicative about their death and what they wanted, and I had two. And so showing what it can mean for a family to know, and it's something that I think Tom did as well. He knew that he wanted, where he wanted to die, with Kathy there, on his own terms, and she knew that, and family knew that. That's just a real gift to a family. So it was very interesting to write about that. So she's gone as well. So so I've written about her, I've written about him. I'm done. I'm going back to my novel writing. Thank you very much. Do you have any more? No? How are we doing? You have enough? Okay, if you don't mind, I would like to finish by reading a short poem. Shortly before I left the UK to come here, I received this book called A Path of Shadows by John Porter. And it's a book of poetry, but he is from Massachusetts and grew up climbing in the Appalachians. And he's now secretary of the Alpine Club in the United Kingdom. Yeah. But he's brought out a book of poetry that I received and read wrapped, and asked him if he would mind if I read one of his poems to you before we broke for the evening. This is called Passing By, and it seems apt. When passing by and looking up on golden snows and mountain thrones, strange to know this place I've been to walk the sky within my bones. Such paradise lives beyond the world, beyond the reach of comfort zones. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Barbara Jo.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Kathy, for joining us this evening. Thank you to the audience, everyone here who's hopefully enjoyed tonight's talk. This was very enjoyable from my seat. I'm sure it was from yours as well. Thanks for Tom to making tonight happen and for being here in spirit with us this evening. I'd like to thank our partners, McDonald Bookshop, who you can meet on your way out the door. Pick up a copy of your book, get it signed by our author while she's still here with us. Thanks to the local businesses and organizations who help support tonight's event, including Kent Mountain Adventures and Rocky Mountain Conservancy. And most of all, thanks to Friends and Foundation for making programs like tonight available for our community. Have a good night, everyone.